Yes, I welcome to the literature series for 52 Living Ideas and the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. This is the 7th of 10 events on Mary Shelley's masterpiece, Frankenstein. The agenda, I'm going to give a brief synopsis to highlight the 1/4 of the novel that is our focus for this event. Then we will be inviting anyone who's read the book for their interpretations, their reflections, and their commentaries. Open-ended, go however you want. Then we're going to do a 30-minute breakout where in a smaller group, we can probably break 11 into 2 groups. And then everyone can discuss whatever they want about this section of the novel. When we come back from the breakout, there will be a group Q&A where everyone, again, can participate. So my synopsis. We resume the novel as the creature continues to relate the first year of his life to Victor Frankenstein, his creator, in the valley of Chamonix near the glacier Mer de Glace, known in the novel by its older name of Montagne Verte. This part of the novel feels a little like a Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age novel, except we have been forewarned that the outcome is tragedy, not the typical Bildungsroman where you overcome the odds. Interpretation is what we consider and how we consider it. And as the creature, if we read how Walton, John Walton, at the conceit of the novel is that these are letters from John Walton to his sister, and Victor Frankenstein was rescued from an iceberg and gets to know the captain, John Walton, who's traveling to the Arctic to discover the North Pole. And the novel then becomes the story that Victor Frankenstein tells John Walton. That's the Walton in some of his letters to his sister Elizabeth talks a bit about how he comes of age. In earlier parts of the novel, we get Victor's story of how he comes of age. And now we're getting how the creature comes of age. So one way to interpret the novel is as a series of intersecting Bildungsroman, whose result is a tragedy. There are so many ways to pick which elements to consider and how to consider them, how to interpret it, that this novel seems infinitely interpretable. The section of the novel we are reading today begins with the arrival of the Arabian girlfriend, Safie, girlfriend to Felix de Lacy, in the de Lacy household in exile outside France. Felix lives in poverty with his sister Agatha and his blind father. The creature is spying on the family from a hovel so he can educate himself about the language and customs of people to allay his need for companionship and sociability. So far in the novel, all his interactions with humans have resulted in their rejection at his hideous appearance. Safie does not know French, and the French lessons she starts receiving help the creature master that language and its writing at the superhuman pace of Master Within 1 Year. The novel takes on the character of a novel about language, exploring the nature and intricacy of language, its role in human affairs. Felix instructs Safie from Volney's The Ruins of Empires, which was published in 1791. This finally gives us a rough date for the novel, the 1790s. In Walton's letters at the beginning, he dates it to 17 blank blank. But now we know that this part of the novel, the education of the creature, must come after 1791. Also, Victor Frankenstein studied at the University of Ingolstadt, and that university in 1800 was moved to Landshut and later to Berlin. It's still in operation, but no longer is the University of Ingolstadt. Through Volney and other literature, the creature learns not only French, but about European culture, the nature of human society, and the nature of a person, our personhood. This leads to an identity crisis for the creature. What was I? Since he has no friends or relations, and all of his interactions with humans have been violently repelled by the humans. The story of the de Lacy family and their banishment by the French government, reducing them to poverty, gives the background for another installment in this novel's series of critiques of the criminal justice system. Is this a novel to illustrate Mary Shelley's father's critique of the criminal justice system? That is one way we could interpret the novel, just hone in on that part. Many allusions and clues as to the status of women in the 19th century society of Mary Shelley are embedded in the text. The wrongly accused Turk who Felix rescues has a treasure, which refers to his daughter Safie. We are told that Safie valued the idea of marrying a Christian and living, quote, in a country where women were allowed to take a rank in society. Interpretation is picking and choosing which considerations we highlight and focus on, and then organizing them in some way, how we organize the considerations. We could interpret the story as a novel of critique of women's status in society and women's rights. Despite all the creature's preparations, reading Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, The Sorrows of Werther, quite an accomplishment for a 1-year-old, and all his other learning of French and the culture of France and Europe, the creature's poignant and dramatic engagement with the blind elder de Lacy is rejected when Felix throws him out and rescues his family and Safie from the hideous monster who only sought their sociability. We hear the story of the creature's rage and upset at his rejection by his, he called them, protectors, and the story of his murder of William. Finally, the murder mystery of the novel is resolved. But did the creature really intend to harm the child? When you read the passage closely, it's very ambiguous. He admits he murdered the child, but when you read the passage, it's very ambiguous. Why does a child as William exhibit such prejudice so young? The creature hoped that a young child wouldn't be prejudiced against his hideous form. But no, William, almost worse than all the others, lashes out at him. What is the story of anger and revenge, which, like all the other novels' themes, seems to come in and go out in phases, but each time gives us enough considerations that the attentive reader can pick and choose elements to organize and reorganize into interpretations of many kinds. The creature makes a requisition of his creator, Victor Frankenstein. Quote, "My companion must be of the same species and have the same defects. This being you must create." He adds, quote, "You must create a female for me, with whom I can live in the interchange of those sympathies necessary for my being." After a dramatic and engaging back and forth dialogue discussing the requisition between Victor and his creature, Victor agrees that he, as creator, deserves to help his one unnatural offspring leave Europe and enjoy the mutual sociability of a female companion without interfering ever again with humankind. That's their agreement. The novel, again, a chapter or two later, takes on the character of a travelogue. We've had the travelogue motif many times earlier. Victor and his friend Clerval travel across Europe to go to England to get the technical knowledge that Victor needs to fulfill his promise, and he wants to do it away from home. So in England rather than in Geneva, Switzerland. Victor separates from Clerval to finish the female creature on a remote island in the Orkney Islands of northern Scotland. Mary Shelley's dramatic use of scenery and imagery for the setting of each scene is wonderfully creative. To what extent did she help create the modern Gothic horror ethic or style? And to what extent is this scene setting part of a tradition of Gothic horror stories which she joined and contributed to? All different ways to interpret it through the history of the literature of the Gothic literature style. As Victor nears the completion of the female creature, he reflects on the project and suddenly wonders, quote, "Had I a right for my own benefit to inflict this curse upon everlasting generations?" His logic is flawed. Not only the original creature, but also the female creature he's about to finish could be the saviors for humanity, helping us bring in a new era of peace, sociability, and the ending of the prejudices to which the creature has been subjugated by every human being he has met, including his creator. But Victor only imagines the worst case and tore to pieces the thing on which I was engaged. The creature confronts him and threatens him. "I shall be with you on your wedding night." Victor receives a letter from Clerval asking him to meet him in Perth, Scotland, in a week's time. Victor prepares the remains of the female creature for a stone basket burial at sea. Afterwards, burying her 4 miles offshore, he falls asleep, and a storm picks up and takes him on a dramatic transport through the Hebrides, probably, to the northern seaside town, to a northern seaside town in Ireland. Maybe it's today's Northern Ireland. It's, there's not enough in the novel to know. But the people drag him to the local magistrate, who wants to inquire with him on a murder from the night before. And our reading ends with this dramatic suspense. Okay, now it is time to invite readers of the text for your interpretations, reflections, and commentaries, mainly on this part of the novel, but you're welcome to talk about how that intersects with the rest of the novel. If you can, I'd be interested to know what set of considerations you were inspired to organize into one or more interpretations. You can type an exclamation point in the chat so that we can set up a queue. Sometimes that's easier to manage than raising your hand, but you can raise your hand also. But we prefer if you put an exclamation point in chat. To invite you to contribute, I have some more questions that might stimulate someone to jump in. What occurred to you as considerations when reading this part of the novel, or preferably when rereading the novel? This is our second pass through. We read the 1818 version, and now we're reading the 1831 version. I did that for two reasons. One is just the different feel of each edition may evoke different interpretations. And rereading, even if you reread the same edition, can often evoke new interpretations, new elements to highlight, consider, put together. If anyone has read the novel multiple times, it'd be interesting to hear about how your different times through evoked different reflections and different interpretations. And, did the 1818 or the 1831 versions give anything substantial you want to talk about? Any of these issues or anything at all about the section of the novel I synopsized, please put an exclam in chat.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Allison, followed by Zach. Allison, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that, this idea of the other is really like the way he's ostracized, the creature's ostracized. It's really symbolic of there's always people in every society that are ostracized. Every society has that group that, and you even see it like with children, where there's like certain children that are ostracized. And usually it's somebody that's different in some way. And I think, probably for many of us, because, if you're really intelligent, that's not the norm, So if, anybody that has a pretty high intelligence ratio understands what that feels like, where you're not really feeling like you're one of everybody, but you want to be one of the group. So I think that's a really big theme, and you can apply it to so many different situations in the world, whether it's racism or, just, the black sheep of the family or whatever it is, anyone who doesn't quite fit in. So often in our world, we ostracize them for not fitting in. And then I think the other thing is, the cruelty really of Frankenstein, of not letting him have his partner. I mean, here he is, he's going to get ready to go get married, and then he's denying him the same joy. It's just so cruel. And I think it's very much, you know, an eye for an eye. When he's threatening, he's like, well, then I'm going to show up on your wedding night. Which, you know, yes, is a horrible thing to do. But on the other hand, it's like, why can't he just let him have one person, just one, you know? I know those are just my main thoughts for right now.
Thank you, Alison. Next up is Zach.
Yeah, so this section, kind of the way I kind of summed up this section was really like the making of the monster. You're really seeing like the turning points where, you know, at this point, at the beginning of this section, he still has faith in humanity and maybe a naive faith that he can be loved and accepted by humans, other humans. He even says like, oh, if I just, you know, present myself to Delancey and like he'll accept me and then he'll bring me into the fold. And when that doesn't happen, you know, you start to hear all this like resentment towards his creator, resentment. I mean, not resentment explicitly towards God, but you could interpret that as his resentment towards the creator, is resentment towards God. And then even still, so I thought that was going to be his breaking point. And even still, he maintains a bit of a glimmer of, I guess, optimism or faith in humanity. And when he sees the girl drowning and decides to save her, you know, and then, you know, then her dad like shoots at him, I think is what happens. And at that point, he's just kind of like, screw this. Like I'm done. And, you know, seeks his revenge on Frankenstein. And I guess all of that, the whole kind of theme struck me very much as like, I guess my interpretation was like, you could think of her as basically saying like humans are born good or born compassionate, and it is, you know, society, it is isolation, it's alienation that, you know, turns people into monsters. Maybe that's oversimplification. And I actually watched the 1931 movie of Frankenstein this week, just to kind of see where it was coming from. And it's so different from the book, just so different from the book. And one of the things that struck me is in the movie, Frankenstein is a monster like right off the bat and just malicious right off the bat. And the reason that they give in the movie for why he's malicious is because he's given the brain of a criminal. So it's just, to me, it seemed like a very interesting contrast, because it seems like, well, the producer or whoever had a hand in kind of like writing that movie seemed to have more of a thought that like, oh, it's nature that makes us evil, you know? And like, oh, if you have a criminal's brain, like you will be a monster. That's kind of how, so I don't know. That's kind of what has been bouncing around in my head this last week as far as this text goes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zach. Does Jeannie want to comment? Doug should be commenting soon, but Jeannie, would you like to comment?
Well, I think this whole thing about the outcast, and I imagine a society where this will not happen. But I wonder, because it's a very natural thing. You see it with animals. You know, animals also will attack, you know, the one that stands out or the one that, you know, is a little different. So I just don't know if we can ever get beyond this treatment. And I mean, I've known various people. I knew one woman who was just absolutely, totally crippled, arms, legs, everything. And yet she tried to maintain, a really happy disposition, and perhaps, well, I'm not sure. I think, in the past, sometimes these people were honored and given special positions in society. But it's a very, very difficult place to be where, especially the appearance, if your appearance is something strange, people just react in such terrible ways. And I remember with myself, when I was young, even, I was afraid of people who were in a wheelchair. And I think that it actually stems from a fear of disease. So that anything that you see that looks a little strange, I think it's a natural fear. So, not that we can't get over it, but that the fear is that whatever you're seeing could be contagious to you. And so that is the basis of it. I don't know if we can ever get over it, though.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie. Next up is Doug. Doug, go ahead. Doug, you're on mute. Just a second. I want to make sure that everything is working. Oh, sorry. My mistake. Go ahead, Doug. Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, you're not. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't allowed to unmute. Also trying to get an area where the camera works a little better. This is a really amazing section in that it's there's so much that changes and shifts, and where we hear the history of the creature, and he confronts the creator, and he makes a requisition which the creator agrees to. It's like Adam, who's lonely, and so he makes a helpmeet for him. But this creator is not that generous, but he has a lot of reasons for why he doesn't do what he's said he would do, particularly related to the creature. And there's a lot of naivete, and there's such a swing of emotions in the whole rhythm of the relationship between the creator and the creature, that it's almost like a really dysfunctional codependency, or borderline personalities who lock into each other. Except the creature starts, I think the things that are really clear about the creature is that he's really curious, and he has an innate sense of joy in his senses and his ability to discover things. Even when he sees fire, he has this joy that it's warm, and he plunges his hands in and he's hurt, but then he comes to a conclusion, a philosophical conclusion. It's a really sharp mind that's at work, and there's a kind of joy with which he attacks the learning process. And that, once the creator's view of the creature comes in, that almost completely disappears, because it is, as Allison says, it's like he's the other. And I took a 20-week course with a very interesting rabbi on 20th century Jewish philosophy, and maybe I've mentioned it before. But one of the through lines in the philosophers of the last 120 so years in Jewish philosophy is the other is very important, like the stranger in the strange land, and the acceptance, don't vex the stranger because you were strangers yourself. And then it's reduced to an idea by a number of different philosophers, which I think I've mentioned before, because Allison or somebody from Madeline maybe had heard of this philosopher, Levinas, I think, where if you hear the cry of the other, you're like God. And if you're deaf to the cry of the other, you're like the pharaohs. And so it seems like Frankenstein is, as a creator, is really deaf to the cry of the other. You can hear it sometimes. And it seems like the creature is always, like one of the prophets, always trying to negotiate a deal where he can be happy. And even at the point where he does his most violent things, like a criminal, it's like he says, well, maybe I can fix this. Maybe I can repair this. Maybe if people really understand me, then I can. And that to me is really interesting. But also the way the nature echoes the moods of the people, it's very Shakespearean that way. Shakespeare, the nature suddenly turns. When a character's mood turns, then the sun disappears, and or it comes out again, or depending on the mood of the character, nature echoes that. And so the first time he actually hears the history of the creature, he's climbing up the mountains trying to improve his mood and take a hike and exercise and get out there, and he's really at the peak of joy as he gets to the peak of the mountain, and then suddenly his creature shows up and he freaks out and he hears this terrible story. Although he's sympathetic to much of it when he hears it, but then later he just forgets all that and just sort of makes the worst interpretations. And as a couple of people have said, he's run by his fears. But that's very interesting that the mood is so ecstatic and then boom, it falls. And the creature and Frankenstein are repeatedly falling, like in the Garden of Eden story. They have these incredible falls from grace. You know, there's sort of a, sorry, I can't get a stable place to put this. There's a, so there's a series of falls in this. There's a series of the, you know, Bildungsroman, as he said, where there's this birth and growth that ends in tragedy. But just as there's a coming of age story, there's also a fall for every one of them. And even the monster, very early on, even before he talks about Paradise Life, he says, oh, there's some Adam here, but then there's maybe more of Satan here, and there's maybe more, or before we know he's read Paradise Lost. And so so Adam is often associated with Prometheus. So there's something very creative about potential here, as many people have pointed out, that he could, you know, this couple could save the world, but, you know, by creating a, you know, utopia that everybody else settles in and understands and learns about. I just watched Lost Horizon, which is about disappearing into a utopia, the old movie with Ronald Colman and Sam Jaffe. And so this idea that you can build a heaven on earth, but it so often becomes a hell on earth, is a sort of very interesting sort of thing that this novel picks up on very, very early. So there's a sort of where the utopian turns dystopian. I think I'll stop there. The emotional swings really struck me. The rises up to the mountains and then the fall and then the, you know, and just the speed of this creature, the physical speed, the speed with which he learns things, he devours things. He does seem to me, what Bucky wrote about 200 years later was the child is natural born genius. He's a genius. And then once he learns from other people, he becomes a monster. You know, once he learns patterns from other people, he becomes monstrous. And so I'll leave it there for now and see what others have to say. And I'm going to have to leave about 3 o'clock, a little before.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, CJ.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Does anyone who's read the novel have something to add, something to contribute? I'd love to hear if you've read the novel, some reflection on this part. Okay, Tamana and then Jeannie.
Sure. So I've read this a number of times. I guess the first time I read this, I was probably a teenager in high school. I think I had to read it for one of my English classes. That was many, many years ago. And I think when I read it the first time, I was disgusted by this creature, just his deformity, just how violent he was, how angry he was. Maybe because I was very immature when I was reading this. I didn't have a lot of life experience, I think. I was still a kid. So I sided with Frankenstein. I sided with the creator. I felt his depression. I felt his sorrow and his own anger at himself for creating such a hideous monster. And so over the years, I've read it off and on, and it's become one of my favorite books. I do try to read it at least sort of once a year. And I guess most recently, I read it maybe a couple of months ago. I think I don't feel sorry for Frankenstein anymore. In fact, I feel more sorry for the creature. He's so intelligent. He has superhuman intelligence. He has a good heart. He wants to be accepted by society. I think most of us can probably see ourselves in him because, I mean, sometimes we're rejected by people we want to be friends with, or or certain groups of society. So because of his stature and deformity, that's the only reason why he's rejected by human beings. But I really feel like Frankenstein is the one who's deformed, in my opinion. I think although he looks and acts like human beings all over, he's incredibly selfish. He's depressed, drowning in his own guilt for creating this hideous monster. And he refuses to create another female creature, which is incredibly selfish and incredibly dangerous. So not only does he put himself, but his family also in danger by not negotiating with the creature. So very, very selfish, and he brings this misfortune on himself and his loved ones. Now, his loved ones, I feel sorry for because they are innocent of all of this. They are not aware of this until much more later. So I feel sorry for his loved ones that they're the ones who are kind of wrapped into this tragedy. But I don't feel bad for Frankenstein. And also in this section, I see that he's still a baby, quote unquote baby, but he has amazing ability in critical thinking and mastering language, strength. He loves beauty. He appreciates kindness, goodness. He reads classic books. I mean, what 1-year-old can read the classic books that he's been reading, that he was able to find and start reading? He has logic. He tried to negotiate with his creator, with Frankenstein. If he was accepted in society, in that society, I think he could have benefited humanity in many ways through his intelligence. Maybe he could have been a professor somewhere. Maybe he could have gone to other places and taught languages. Because of his superhuman strength, maybe he could have even helped build cities, build buildings. I mean, there was just an endless amount of opportunities for this creature to benefit his society. But because of all of his superhuman characteristics and abilities, but he's rejected only because he's deformed, which is actually quite sad. And he actually is okay with that being rejected, but he wants someone by his side. He wants a partner, which I thought that takes a lot of courage to be rejected and by all of humanity and be okay with it, as long as he has someone to love and a companion. I thought that's a huge sacrifice. I don't know if people can actually do that. Some people can be hermits, some people can be monks and, go into the mountains, but it's not a very common thing to do because we are social creatures. So I don't know how many human beings can actually shun kind of society and go live in the mountains or woods. We think of those people as strange. But this creature is very unique in this way that he's okay with that as long as he has a female companion and they'll go somewhere. And that was what he tried to negotiate. And Frankenstein completely rejected this and is incredibly selfish and brought all the misfortune on himself and his family. So at this point in my life, I don't feel bad for Frankenstein at all. He did this to himself. He created this monster and abandoned him, and so he pays the price. So I apologize if this sounds really, really evil, maybe. But if I was in this situation, I would think, you know what? If you promise to never, ever, ever, go somewhere far away and with your companion and never, ever, ever interact with humanity, okay. For the sake of my family, I would probably go along with this deal and agree to it, only for the sake of my family. Even if I feel like, oh, I don't know, can I really trust him? But on the other hand, my family is safe. This creature knows where I live, knows my family, knows my house, knows my address. So if he promises that he will never come near me, he'll never hurt my family or myself, then for the safety and protection of my family, okay, I can create this companion for him, and then hopefully he'll never interact with humanity ever again. So
wonderful. Thank you, Tamanna. Appreciate it. Next is Jeannie. Jeannie, go ahead.
So I agree with you so much. I think it's very easy to read this book and just hate the monster. It's not hard at all. I mean, I went through it and you just see, okay, monster, you don't like it. But the one thing I have to disagree, there's a total difference. Once he makes the woman, then he's not only created an individual that's unliked by society, well, not just unliked, hated by society, then he's beginning to create a species that is possibly hated by society. So I mean, it's taking a giant step once he creates. It's not just the companionship, you know. They're going to have the beginning of something new, and that's what's really scary. And in that way, you know, I can go back and forth because really I can sympathize with Dr. Frankenstein. You know, he's been foolish for sure, but he is trying to think through, you know, what he's done and figure out an out. You know, and he is selfish, but you know, aren't we all? I think I love the part where, you know, I think aren't they going across the glacier to find the cave? This is my favorite part where they go across the glacier and he's following him, but not close. And then to get the chance to confront your creator. And it brought me back to, you know, confronting my mom, like, you know, why did you have me? You know, you had other kids. Why did you need to do this? You know, and of course, you know, she has her own reasons and, you know, they don't seem satisfactory. And, you know, why am I here? You know, but of course, the deeper part is, you know, the idea of confronting God. You know, God, you put us here. What are we supposed to do? You know, and, you know, I don't know. Maybe you made a mistake. Sorry.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Doug, followed by Zach. CJ, is it okay for me to moderate or would you prefer to moderate?
Yes, no, that's fine. Let's do Doug and Zach. If someone really wants to do a final comment, throw up an exclam, but we should go into breakouts after Zach.
Sounds good.
Unless someone jumps in.
Doug.
Yeah, I have to leave in a few minutes, so I had one comment that came to mind, but I didn't want to go into it first. A few years ago in a library reading group, I read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, who's this amazing Black Harvard-trained lawyer who works for people on death row, people who are convicted of a crime and are sentenced to capital punishment. And it's a very interesting book. The movie is very two-dimensional compared to the book, or even his 20-minute YouTube presentation is pretty amazing. And it's titled Just Mercy because I think by the end of the book, you realize it's the main theme of it, that in a Christian society, all anybody deserves is mercy. They may need to be imprisoned or they may need to, but capital punishment is not in the cards for him. And in fact, his mentor on the first day of work tells him, if you don't have the capital, you get the punishment. And so it's a very interesting book, and he has a very interesting sense of humor when he deals with this, and is a very a human approach. And one thing he says a number of times to prisoners is, you are better than the worst thing you have ever done. You know, you're better. There's something to be saved. There's something that can be retrieved, and there's something important about you. And so I find myself suddenly, I haven't thought about this in all the readings we've done over the last few months, but just today I began to think about that book, Just Mercy, and what it means. And it's interesting. He learned a lot from his mother and his grandmother and from the church, actually. And so a lot of it comes from that. And he's like deeply human and real, and even an ability to just keep dealing with some of the most vicious guards that he meets in these prisons, who he ends up sort of turning into supporters of his. And not that he's a magic man. He doesn't win allies everywhere, but it's an interesting book. And so the second time through, or the third time through, because I read it a few years ago, and then we read the 1818 and read this one. This time through, I realized how much there is, which has come up before, but how consciously she's dealing with the criminal justice system that really wants to try somebody, rush to judgment, and immediately execute them. without any review or without any kind of questioning that they may be convicting the wrong person or getting the story wrong. And so suddenly he watches that the trial of the maid who's unjustly executed. And then he's now sort of, we're just getting hints of that he's now needs to go be interviewed by somebody. And so that same energy of judgment and counter judgment is sort of coming in. And without much mercy in it at all. So that's it. That's what was my final statement. So
thank you.
Shooting out.
Thank you, Doug. Next up is going to be Zach, and then we'll go to breakout rooms. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add on a little bit to Jeannie's point about the creature wanting to bring a female into the fold, and I found it really telling. This was on page 45 of my translation, or on my edition. The monster says, "Our lives will not be happy, but they will be harmless." And I don't know, like as much as we've been talking about how kind of selfish Frankenstein is, that's kind of a little bit of a selfish thing to do. Like he wants to bring this other monster into existence for his own companionship, knowing full well that she's probably going to live a miserable existence. And I don't know, it got me thinking a lot of times, you know, like when people have children out of a sense of like feeling incomplete in their own lives, and they're like, oh, well, maybe if I have a baby, it'll solve my problems for me, without actually having any consideration of like, you know, the interest of the person that they're bringing into existence. So I don't know. I think the monster is kind of falling into the same trap that Frankenstein fell into, which is just not having any consideration for the being that is being brought into existence, and just kind of thinking about themselves, like, oh, well, my life will be a little less alienated, a little less miserable. But like, yeah, he's even like acknowledging right there, like this monster who we're bringing in is also going to be miserable with me, but doesn't seem to like care about that.
Shrikant, you're muted.
Sorry, Tamanna, you had a quick point. Go ahead.
Yes, I see your point, Zach, and Jeannie, I also see your point. However, it's like with any marriage, you kind of take a risk when you marry someone. You're not sure if you're, let's say, 25, both are 25, you're not sure in 10 years and 20 years how you're, it's sort of like, you know, you kind of, marriage is kind of like that, or being in a relationship is kind of like that. You hope for the best. You want to be positive. You don't know what problems you may face, but you're hoping that whatever problems that do come across, hopefully you'll be able to get through it. So yes, in a way he's selfish for wanting a female companion, but he did mention that he will go far away. The two of them will go far away. But once again, we don't know how the female companion is going to feel, being not beautiful, being this hideous, deformed female creature. So there is that risk of that, of course. There's that risk of what is her opinion of all of this? How does she feel about herself? Is she going to accept how she feels, or is she going to be even more angry and maybe do even more damage to society? So yes, there is that risk. I actually do see that point. But if he did mention that he was going to take her and go far away and live in an isolated part of the planet where there's no human interaction, I think that's a risk to take, I guess. If I was Frankenstein, I would take that risk and still create that female creature, hoping that at least my family will be safe. So it all kind of goes back to saving my family, saving myself, saving my new bride or new groom, whatever. So yeah, I do see your point. Thank you so much. I think this is really interesting. I never thought about it this way. And then, do we even know, can they procreate? That's another thing. Will they be able to have children? And if they do, then are we in trouble? A whole race of these creatures. So yeah, that's another kind of, 18th century, 17th century zombie type of apocalypse. What do we do then if they're able to procreate? So yeah, good point.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Tamanna. Okay, last quick point by Alison, and then we'll go to the breakout rooms. Alison.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about that with the with marriage, because I feel like the whole thing, like I hadn't thought about this book as really being about, you know, the importance of taking chances and risk. Because, and I know a lot of people who say, oh, people have kids because they are lonely. And I don't really think that's accurate. I think most people have children because they like kids, generally, you know, and they want family to continue. And, but I think all, you know, there's never a perfect time to get married. There's never a perfect time to have children. If you wait for perfection, it's never going to happen. And the thing is, it is the ultimate gamble. I mean, even marriage isn't as much of a gamble as children. Children is the only decision that you can't ever take back. It's literally the only one. And so it's a tremendous risk. But I think it is interesting that, you know, you've got the creature who's so willing to take this gamble, and Frankenstein, who has someone who has been so reluctant to take the gamble. Eventually he does, but it is interesting how it's just an interesting lens that I hadn't thought about as I've been reading it. So thanks.
Thank you, Alison. CJ, you want to give instructions for the breakout room?
Yeah, I'd like to focus as much on the text as possible. I know everyone hasn't read it, and you're definitely going to go away from the text, and that's fine. But let's try as often as we can to come back to the text, focusing on this quarter of the novel, and let's go for it.
Okay. So the breakout rooms are going to be led by CJ, one of them, and one of them is going to be led by Zach. CJ, 30 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So starting the breakout rooms now. After 30 minutes, you'll automatically come back here and we'll continue. Can you give a heads up to people what happens next?
Well, the group Q&A, we will be collecting your questions, and then everyone will be invited to answer them. So that's another possibility for your breakout, is to start organizing a question and start discussing it and refining the question, so that when we come back from the breakout, we can explore refined questions instead of first cut questions. But, you know, you can go anywhere you want, just as much as possible. Try to stick to this quarter of the novel as a focal point.
Wonderful. Thank you. Starting the breakout rooms now.
Yeah, so we're going to take any and all questions and then organize them. If we get a lot, we might have to focus on the ones that are either focused on this section of the novel or that more explicitly address the art of interpretation. I want to get a question onto the table about the art of interpretation. How do we consider things as we read a novel, as we reread a novel, as we reread a novel the second, the third time, and how this affects our interpretation? My subtitle for this series is The Art of Interpretation. And so I'd like to engage everyone in a question about interpretation.
Wonderful.
For every event, I have put in the event description a list of themes that I thought hit me as I was reading this section. And I'm just going to briefly go through them in the hopes that one of these themes might remind you of a question that then you would ask us. As soon as you get a question, you can put an exclam in chat. We'll start the queue right now. If you have a question, put an exclam in chat. But let me list this set of themes I highlighted to see if it might help someone form a question. I really thought the theme of language was so important in this section. There's the theme of the history of racism and prejudice that's evoked in the histories that they read. There's this quote of what a strange nature is knowledge. This idea of how what we learn is so emotionally and morally fraught. The issue of identity. What am I if I'm a creature who has no parent? There's another quote I liked. Accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? There's the vice of solitude that not only Victor experiences in his depressions and his nervous breakdowns, but the creature experiences as an outcast of society. Another quote I picked up, the reward of my benevolence. I think that's the creature talking about, like getting shot in the shoulder after he rescues some rustic's friend or daughter. There are issues of domestic tranquility. There's the domestic tranquility of the DeLacy's, the domestic tranquility of Victor and his family, and the plight of the creature and the lack of domestic tranquility for the creature. There are repeatedly issues of discrimination. Another quote I highlighted, the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures as the creature reflects on Paradise Lost. The creature's argument when Victor and the creature are debating, arguing back and forth about his requisition. What did you think of that? What theme came out? What theme is that a part of in the novel? There's the theme of exile, the exile of the DeLacy's, and the exile of the creature promising to go with the female creature far away to never again interact with humanity. There are in the first edition a couple of references to Dante. Dante's Great Commedia is in many ways an epic poem of exile. And we get the eulogy of Clerval in this section. Clerval has not died. We don't believe that Clerval is going to die. And then all of a sudden we get this eulogy that, convinced me that pretty soon Clerval is going to die. So any of those themes might evoke a question. Do we have any questions?
Yes, folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Next up is Zach.
All right, so our breakout group generated a few questions. We had several people who hadn't read it, some people who had seen the movies. One of the questions generated from that, how have the popular movies from the 30s shaped our perception of Frankenstein? And then two other questions we had, was the creature driven by instinct or compassion to save the child from drowning? This was a question Cody brought up. Was it just blind instinct to save the child, or was it something deeper? Was there compassion behind it, or some perhaps selfish interest in saving the child? And then the final question, was the creature's anger and resentment justified, and was the creature's revenge upon Frankenstein's brother William justified?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
I'm trying to form a question. I liked one of the themes that CJ had mentioned when it had come to identity, or what am I? And I kind of think about identity and how does Frankenstein's identity change from when he's witnessing the life of the DeLacy's?
Wonderful.
I mean, you know, if that.
Excellent. Thank you. CJ, how about starting with the question of art of interpretation? Because many people here have been reading Frankenstein multiple times. You know, some of them have been reading at different times in their life, younger and now. So I am also very curious about that, and that's the theme. So how about starting with that? Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. So folks, how is your interpretation of this work changed over time? How do you interpret it? Whether it is across editions, across you reading it over multiple times, and any thoughts about interpretation? Go ahead and type exclamation mark.
Why and how does what we consider and how we consider it exist in the text, or is it in our minds? You know, what is this art of interpretation?
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe.
So
Joe, go ahead. And Tamanna, I would love to hear from you because you've been reading it so many times over, you know, so much, so many years. So it would be really wonderful to hear your take on it. Joe, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, having read it one time, but I've listened to it this time, and listening to it is I think I find myself even more, shall I say, upset with Victor himself, and because there's a certain arrogance that just kind of, I each time I come across this book, I find myself less and less sympathetic to Victor, who has lost his whole entire family, and who's had 2 nervous breakdowns, and you know that, but at the same time, he keeps creating his own problems. You know, he's withholding the secret that could save a lot of people's lives. And he's also, in a sense that, even to the point where, you know, he loses his love of his life. And so I find myself, I think, more being more sympathetic towards the creature. Or, you know, that's the other aspect of it. Each time you read it, you kind of think about how lonely the individual is, what it must be like to be rejected on a continual basis. Those are the 2 themes that I think that kind of, each time you read it, kind of get reinforced, maybe a little bit more than the first time.
Thank you. Tamanna, would you like to share your experience?
Sure. So I think the first time I read this, I think I may have mentioned this earlier, was in high school. It was for one of my English classes, and because it was required reading, we had to get through it. And I remember reading it, and I felt depressed by the novel. It was the tone was very dark from the very beginning. You start hearing about Victor and how he got to that point, and so I was very depressed. I felt sorry for him. I felt like, oh, what a terrible thing that he's done, and it's just so awful, poor guy. And I felt very disgusted by the creature. I felt like, isn't there a way for law enforcement or Victor to gather some people to go chase this monster and kill it and destroy it once and for all, and then, you know, he can move on with this. Everyone can move on with their lives without having this terrible creature in the world. So yeah, I was quite young and probably very immature didn't really have a lot of life experience. So in my mind, reading it as a teenager, I felt like this monster is absolutely disgusting, and I ignored all the things that he observed and the beauty and language and seeing all this, even the good things that he did. I just ignored all of it, I remember, and just hated the creature, because I guess we're in a society that we always want to look at beauty. We always want to look at people who are, sort of fit a social, social customs, and anyone who's sort of different, it gets rejected. So, I'm a part of society. So I guess I just grew up thinking that way, that he's just so different, this creature. He just needs to just be destroyed, and hopefully everyone can go on with their lives. But over time, as I read it, I felt more and more sympathetic towards the creature. And now I see his point. I see why he wanted to negotiate, and I see his point in having a female companion, so that he can finally have someone where he's not completely lonely, and hopefully live somewhere far away from the rest of society and maybe have that life. So nowadays I don't feel so angry towards or disgusted towards the creature, but in fact I feel more upset with Victor, and I feel like he's the one who should be blamed, and he's the one who's incredibly ugly within himself. Maybe he looks perfect as a human being. He's not deformed on on the physical part, but I feel like he's more ugly, he's more deformed, because of the fact that he not only created this creature but abandoned it, and then rejected him, denied, going along with this deal and creating a female creature, because he's the one who can create the female creature. There's no one else who can do it. He's the only person that can do this and make this creature finally happy, quote unquote happy. And he rejects it, and it's so I feel more anger towards Victor than I do towards the creature now. But I think people brought us some great points about, well, what if the female creature is they both reject each other, or she rejects him, the male creature, or what if they're able to procreate and start creating a race of these kinds of creatures? That would be terrible for humanity. So people did bring up some great points.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tamanna. Anybody else would like to talk about the art of interpretation? I want to add one thing. Go ahead, Jeannie. Yours.
Well, I think in our society, it's almost impossible to avoid the meme of what we all grew up with, of Frankenstein, being the monster himself. I mean, we call the monster Frankenstein. It's a confusion, but on the other hand, it's so true. And I think in, watching the movies, you see the monster, you scream, you run away. This is a normal human behavior. To me, the deeper interpretation that really, hit me over the head as a message from Mary, to our society is that, we need to be careful of what we're creating. It was the arrogance of thinking that you could bring life, into this world, on your own, in your own, secret little way. I mean, he didn't even share this with the people who were important to him, like his teachers and stuff, or his family. He shared it with no one. He just went ahead and thought, I'm going to do this thing. I know how to do it, and I can do it. And you know what? He failed. He failed miserably. And this is the message that, really hits to me, that you got to be careful of what you're creating. And it is so true for our current world. We've created, a big monster for ourselves.
Many big monsters.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Allison.
Couldn't hear you, Shrikant.
Oh, sorry. Allison, go ahead.
I think one of the the problems with great literature is that it's often taught in high school when people don't have the life experience to really be able to understand it. And I know why they do it because they figure it's their one chance of kind of forcing people to read it. And if they don't do it, then they might never pick up these books ever in their lives. But the thing with it is that I'm finding is when you read stuff and you read it again and again and again over different times in your life, a lot of the meaning that comes from books is about connecting it to things in your life. And what they say is it's called text to text, text to world, and text to self connections. So the more life experience you have, you can connect it to other books. You connect it to things that have gone on in the world or experiences that you've had. So I think it's really important, especially with, I mean, I used to always have kind of like, I don't know, like I was working my way through the canon, trying to read all the great books. But lately I've started rereading a few of them favorites again. And just to see, do I have the same impressions? Do I have the same feelings? And I still, you know, the books that I loved when I was younger, I still love, but in a different way. And I feel like I see so much more in it now because I've had life experiences that just make it better, really. And, you know, you see sides of it that I couldn't have seen when I was young.
Thank you. CJ, I had a comment. Go ahead, CJ.
No, your comment first.
Okay. Now, I'm not familiar with Frankenstein, but the issue of art of interpretation applies to everything. You know, I'm focusing right now just on literature. And here's what I've found. You know, there are many books that I've read multiple times across my life. So first, it has to do with the depth of work. I'm talking now only about works which are deep enough that you can read them 12 times, and each time there is more. So many of these works are like onions. You know, first you get the first layer, then once you get this, then you go to the next layer and you see the next layer. Because you've taken in the first few layers, you're able to see something deeper. So that is one characteristic of great literature, is that there is a depth, and you slowly learn about the depth which is there in the work itself. So that's one thing that happens on multiple readings. The second part of it is you can also think of it as a mirror. It's like a multi-dimensional mirror, these works of art. The way you respond to them actually is showing you something about where you are. And at different stages of your life, you can see that, oh, now this one hits me. Before I just kind of went through it without noticing it. It hits me because I am different. So it's a way of showing yourself, you know, seeing yourself in the work. So those are the two phenomena that happen, and they are both related. As you plumb the depth of the work, try to understand it, it acts as a deeper mirror. You know, it's going to throw light on things that you did not, you know, which were maybe were already there, but because you understand the work, it now relates to it. Sometimes you have changed. So those are the two phenomena I see happening in any work, any great work that I have read over multiple years, multiple times. CJ.
So my context for, well, actually, I decided to do this series on Frankenstein independently, but it's occurring in the context of my other series, 26 essays, 26 videos, the series we do once a month on Wednesday nights, the comprehensivity series, comprehensivist Wednesdays. And in that series, I've been focusing on the importance of multiple perspectives, multiple working hypotheses, and learning that in breadth for context and in depth for clarity. And one of the things I'm sort of fishing with in this art of interpretation is how we can, well, one angle is how our comprehensivity, what we bring to the reading, what we know in breadth, what we know in depth, as Tamana and Allison mentioned, your life experience, that will shape which parts of it in this reading stand out, hit you, that you connect with. And one of the things I'm trying to do with the art of comprehensivity is try to identify and articulate and enable more people to more often go into either a work of literature or work of nonfiction or our daily lives and find other ways of perceiving it, other ways of hypothesizing about it, other perspectives, and so in my synopsis, I tried to highlight different parts that as I was reading, I said, one's comprehensivity, one's art of what my experience and what I tunes into, can pick and choose maybe the travel log, or maybe the identity crisis, or maybe the coming of age story, or different ways to start to see a work not as the one interpretation I have, but the set of interpretations that maybe I should explore a little bit. And I worry the way we teach literature in school, we're asked to come up with a topic sentence that summarizes the story. How can you summarize a great work of literature like Frankenstein in one topic sentence? There are 100 ways to interpret it. That would lead to 100 topics. And why not ask the child to create 3 or 5 and compare and contrast them? And so what I've been trying to engage with this art of interpretation is the challenge to see the things you're reading and highlight them from perspectives that weren't your first time through, that to keep shaping your comprehensivity through the art of interpretation, through what you highlight, through how you connect it to something you know in breadth or to something you know in depth, and then tie the novel into our civilization, our lives. So,
CJ, I want to bring to your notice something amazing that we did in the last Comprehensivist Wednesday with Phil, which shows a completely deeper dimension to interpretation. Because you can do interpretation of the material of what the world is, what the novel is saying, but at a deeper level, you can do interpretation of the style of the novel, or basically how are people thinking? What kind of method of thinking is being shown by the characters? And this guy, Eric Orbach, is amazing at doing that. So in this meetup, we compared what is going on in the minds of the characters in Odysseus with the minds of the character in the Old Testament, and what style of thinking, what style of using consciousness is being implied by everything that is being said. So this is interpretation of what is going on in the minds of people. And this guy, Eric Orbach, is he is basically one of the founders of the field of literary criticism that shows that, across different authors, throughout history. So I just wanted to, bring that to everybody's notice. All right, shall we go to the next question?
Yes.
Okay, how about taking, so there are the following things. I want to take the general ones. So one is about identity, and one is about anger and resentment. So we can take both of them, maybe let's see how we're doing on time. we're kind of coming to the end of the time. So you can choose whichever one you want to talk about. One, how does the identity of the creature himself, his own identity of who he is, change over time? That's one. And second, the anger and resentment that the creature has and the actions that he does as a result of that. Do you think they're justified or not justified? And you can talk about either of them. You can connect them both, whichever one you would like. CJ, is that good?
Yeah, let's see what people come up with.
Sure. Let's start with Joe.
Pertaining to whether the anger is justified as he becomes more aware as to what he is and what he does not have and how he doesn't fit in to this world. I think that's his actions aren't justified, but it's hard to, it's hard to even, and you figure that what he's been able to learn through language and what he's been reading, that he does know the difference between right and wrong. He does frame a person. So I think that you can't get away from that. I don't think that was justified. But I can understand that some of the actions that he's taking are just pure rage. Somebody that's been just beaten like a dog their entire life, that it's like a dog that if it's been beaten and beaten and beaten, it's going to be just like almost uncontrollable to a certain degree. And so that it has to be put down at a certain point. In fact, that's what they do to those dogs. Dogs that have been put into these like pits where they fight each other. And that's all they know. That's the way I think of his evolution. The real tragedy in this is that there's this degree of consciousness where he appreciates what it means. He just wants to love someone. He just he appreciates what normal people have. And you do wonder if he had just been given a chance to live a normal life, what he would be like. That's, he forms an identity, that's for sure. His identity changes. He adopts the identity of the people he observes. He adopts the identity of the environments that he's in. Unfortunately, his anger is part of that, and but his anger is part of it is a direct result of a complete rejection by everybody he's ever known, including the person that created him. So I don't think I wouldn't hold him responsible for his actions. That's all. And that's a kind of except for framing, that's the only thing that I hold him responsible for.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Dave, followed by Zach. Dave.
Yeah, we had a good discussion in the breakout room, and I think Tamana's comment in the first part brought me to the realization the monster is me. And you're talking about the depth earlier, Srikant. I think a lot of stories are on two different levels. I mean, the surface level is this, it's a book about this terrible monster, but to me, it's a book on social commentary. And I've had rejection. I bet you've had rejection. We all had rejection. And looking for a spouse, looking for a partner, these are common themes. And I think we were talking about in the breakout session that the more you get into the depth of this book, you see it's a story about the human condition. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Zach.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was thinking about during this section was the book of Job, from the Old Testament. Because in the story of Job, Job is kind of experiencing all of this unjustified suffering and then confronts God and is basically saying, what the heck? Like, what gives? And there's a similar theme here with Frankenstein, or excuse me, with the creature. You know, all this unjust suffering, all of this unjust alienation. You know, even when he tries to do the right thing, saving this young girl's life, what does he get for it? He's shot in the arm for it. And then that kind of wanting that explanation, which goes back to, again, why this piece is timeless. It's just like, just listen to all the, you know, this is the same reason that Job is timeless. It's the same reason that, you know, like the myth of Prometheus, like all these other things that we've been tying it to, is because the details can change, but these are these age-old questions that are just never going to cease puzzling us. And I don't know, I think it's like, I understand the creature's anger and his need to retaliate, but I feel like if we're going to let him off the hook, we also have to let off the hook, you know, all of these other people who have done horrific things, because of this resentment that has built up in them due to feelings of injustice. You know, whether or not there actually were injustice, maybe they have this, you know, faulty conception of justice of, oh, this is how, you know, a good person acts in the world, and I've just been doing all of these things that, you know, in my head are the right way to act, and what do I get for it? You know, my wife leaves me, or, you know, this people beat me up at school, and there's this kind of conception of like, oh, I've done everything right. And I think the creature has that idea of, I don't know, I've done everything right. And yeah, I don't know. So I don't have an answer. I think it's why this book is timeless, why Job is timeless. There's not really an answer to the kind of undue suffering, or the you know, the kind of problem of evil, or the problem that sometimes bad things happen to good people. But yeah, I'm really enjoying the novel. So
thank you. I'm going to do one last question, CJ, because it kept coming.
Well, let me jump in very briefly. I mean, thank you, Joe and Zach and all. I think it's fun to reflect on the role of identity and justice and anger and revenge, and certainly the novel's full of it. And Joe's point about the creature leaving the photo that he took from the murdered William in Justine's dress fold, that she might be pinned with the crime. You know, when I read that, it occurred as a spur of the moment thing. Oh, I've got this picture, you know, maybe, you know, our spur of the moment anger items of the same moral consequence as intentional moral outrages. You know, for me, that I would place more fault if it's intentional. And the murder of William and the framing of Justine seemed to me to be spur of the moment. Well, with William, it's not even clear. He was just trying to quiet the boy, and he may not have known his own strength. It might have been an accidental murder. Hey, boy, you're saying this nasty stuff to me. You know, shut up. And oh my God, you're dead now. You know, there are many ways to interpret this, and that's my point, as I just said a moment ago, that, you know, how to consider it and what to consider is a fine art that never ends. And so let me leave it there.
CJ, do you think we have time for one more question, or shall we wrap up?
Let's. Which question?
I was thinking, because there is a point that Jeannie brought up, Allison brought up, many people, the discussion revolved around that, and that's the issue of responsibility when you create something. When Frankenstein, he created this thing, he created this creature, and then he just walked away. He refused to do whatever is needed, and that happens a lot. And especially in the modern age, where we have the capability of creating things, but most people do not take the responsibility. They do not follow through. They kind of said, okay, I'm done. They don't think about the consequences beforehand, and after they have created, they do not look at the consequences of what they have done. They do not do whatever is needed. Go ahead.
This is so important a question. I'd love to hear what people have to say about it.
Wonderful. Go ahead, folks. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to comment on this question. We'll start with Joe.
Yeah, I think that this is like where you're more worried about your own personal accomplishment, and to hell with the circumstance, to the results. Like, you just want to see that something can be done. And it's an incredibly selfish and irresponsible act at the highest of levels. This isn't even like something where I have a kid and I'm not going to take care of it. It's much more thoughtful, I should say, in the sense that you're creating a creature, right before, as Victor's going through this whole process of creating the creature, he's talking about himself, like how he's going to be this great scientist. And so that it's more of his ego than anything. And that to me is, it's much worse. It's like than anything that somebody else is responsible.
Joe, I'm wondering if you mean the way in which Victor gets into this scientific program of
the whole process.
Discovery is more important than the consequences. I want to discover the elixir of life. I want to discover the secret of life so that I can give immortal life to humans, that I can create creatures like a god? Or are you referring to the selfish, egoistic part of a particular scientist who wants renown for having made the discovery of the secret of life? Is it more the ego level, or is it the issue of discovery separated from the objective and consequences?
I think it's discovery separated from the objective and the consequences. If you're talking about his pure interest in science, I mean that, he's gone through all the sciences, all the mathematics, he went through everything. But I don't think those two are mutually exclusive either. I think the two are actually intertwined with one another. I think your ego becomes part of that. Yeah.
Your interpretation would read the novel as a critique of science.
Yes.
That science should absolutely consider the consequences of what it's doing, the moral scope, and not just
the boundaries. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The boundaries of nature should not be pushed.
Great, thank you. Jeannie wants to say something.
and how easy it is to go wrong. I mean, here you have somebody that was brought up in a nice family, had everything, well off, everybody loved him, and still he really screwed up bad. It makes you wonder, who is capable of taking on big projects that are irreversible, say.
Thank you, Ginny. Next up is Allison.
Yeah, I really felt like it was his ego that wouldn't let him make the the bride for the creature, because he had made up his mind and he was just going to be completely stubborn about it. And even when he says, I'm going to, watch out on your wedding night, I'm going to come after you, you would think that most people in that situation would want to protect their family first. But he didn't. What he wanted to protect was his ego above his own family. That stubbornness, or just, this is what I've decided and I'm not changing my mind no matter what.
But Allison, if his supposition were correct, and it's debatable, but he's assuming that the creature and the female creature are going to reproduce and create a race of creatures who are going to be so ostracized by humans that it creates, nuclear holocaust, and destroys the world. Is that egoism, or is that trying to protect the planet and civilization from a dangerous escape of scientific knowledge?
I mean, I guess it is, but it's also a leap because we don't even know if they could create children on their own, And then
Well,
even
it's
if
kind of assumed when he goes to England, that's what he's going there to learn.
yeah,
That was his intent on that little trip. He's going to go to England and find out how to do the female part of the body.
yeah,
And, why would you do the female part of the body unless it could be,
right,
procreation?
Allison, finish your thought.
Sorry.
Oh, no, I mean, I guess that is a part of it, but yeah, what I was thinking is, like, you don't know for sure if they would be able to reproduce. And then even if they had children and then those children reproduce with each other, they'd be, siblings, and then the next group would be cousins. So who knows what that would do to the gene pool, and if any of these babies would even survive, so it's a really big risk. I mean, I think most people in that situation, you just think, all right, we don't even know if they're going to get to South America, what's going to happen there. I think most people in that situation would say, I'm just going to protect my fiance first and then worry about the rest later. But yeah,
So,
he did always put science ahead of his family throughout the entire novel, though.
are you arguing for the precautionary principle that if the risks are unknown but potentially great, we should act to protect?
I mean, actually, I was kind of thinking the other, they should have protected the family. But not to jump ahead, but I felt like the last part of the book where he's just chasing him on and on and on and on. I felt like, he had this anger towards the creature, but really his anger was at himself, because he knows that he's the one who did that to himself, really. If he had made different choices, his family would all still be alive. But because he made these choices, the creature did these things. But I think, at the end of the day, his anger is towards himself.
Thank you, Allison. CJ, any closing thoughts?
Well, I like the idea, Allison. You've convinced me that there's a wonderful interpretation of this novel where you look at it as Dave has been saying, as the creature and the results are us, and we should make decisions based on our family and our situation. But for me, when I read it, I just love the idea of how we would protect civilization. What do we need to do to protect against climate change? What do we need to do to protect against nuclear war? There have been threats of nuclear war in the global news lately. What do we need to do to protect against all these things that science has unleashed as possibilities onto our civilization? And for me, I like reflecting, what is Mary Shelley suggesting our responsibility to civilization is? And maybe in this one instance, Victor's making the right decision. Even though I disagree that he's analyzed it holistically, there may be as much reason to believe that the creature and the female creature will produce a race that brings about peace and harmony and the end of all conflict on the planet, the end of all prejudice. Victor looks at the precautionary principle. It might go wrong. Can I take the risk and create this female creature that may, even if the odds are low, result in the devastation of all civilization? It's something to consider.
Thank you, CJ. Would you like to close up with it?
No sound, Shrikant.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, now it's back.
CJ, any closing thoughts before we close?
In 2 weeks, we cover the last quarter of the novel, the ending. And I look forward to joining you then.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Shrikant.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.